everyone. Welcome to the MyCom Podcast. We're all about church marketing and communications, and today we've got a special guest to talk about some of the challenges communicators face in some younger churches. Sophia Agtarap, former Minister of Online Engagement for Rethink Church, is joining us today. She's a strategic communications consultant, and she's on staff at Vanderbilt Divinity School doing communications work, including social and digital media. Sophia, welcome.
Thanks. It's really good to be here with you all.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. If you want to check out some of her work, you can go to belovedcommunity.online, where she's pulled together resources for people of faith to more deeply engage some of the current issues of our day. There's liturgy, there's action items, and media on topics like economic justice and immigration. She also blogs at wanderingnotlost.com. Anyway, we're really glad to have you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to join you in conversation today.
Right on. So tell us a little bit about some of the breadth of your experience doing communications work in the church world.
Yeah, so my entree into communications work with the church is an interesting one. I have a background in education and decided to work on my doctorate in education. But as I was doing that, I was working with underrepresented students at the University of Washington. And as my work included communications, I started to ask myself, what would it look like if we did communications well for the church? And so I pivoted and went from my doctorate in education to a master's in communication and digital media at the University of Washington. And so after doing that, I accepted a job at First Church, which is a downtown United Methodist church, the oldest congregation in Seattle, but had found that it needed to move buildings because of some structural damage. And so now found itself in a new community that was mostly as gated as can be in an urban setting. And so people just were living in high-rises who were more interested in going to yoga and coffee on a Sunday morning than showing up to church, right? Which I think we're seeing all over the country, really, as we engage with different people who are looking for different things. And so the question was, what does communication look like for this congregation as we are new to the community? What would it look like to do communication well as we invited new people into this community? And who is our community? I think those were some of the bigger questions, is what does this community look like for this day?
What a crazy entrance to the world of church communications to take one of the oldest churches in the area and become something totally new. It seems like that sounds almost like a church plant.
I think it very much was. I think that's how a lot of the staff looked at it, because you're in new digs, like brand new building, brand new location within the city, people who you have not been in relationship with. And so that was for sure a challenge for that leadership. And I think they found their place, and they're very active in terms of the issues around the city. It has been a meeting place for folks. The Pride Parade ends at the footsteps of that church. And so what does it mean then to be a welcoming space for people who might not ever engage with a church, but who might consider engaging with a church, depending on the type of hospitality that you would offer. So so that was my entree into church communications. Worked in higher ed, worked here at United Methodist Communications as the Minister of Online Engagement with Rethink Church. And that has certainly been an eye-opening experience in terms of what ministry looks like in this online space with, millennials disconnected from a faith community, whether they have never had exposure to a faith community or they have decided church is not for me. What does that look like to be the church for those folks?
Yeah, those are huge questions. So as a communicator, as a marketer, what are your particular emphases? What are the things that you always bring with you to the table anywhere you go?
Yeah, so I probably bring more questions than answers, I think. Communications is one of those diverse fields that we always find working in the background and is not necessarily at the forefront of, any movement or conversation, but is something that undergirds a lot of what happens. And so if communication is done well, I think you don't notice it because it's done well. So when I enter into a relationship with a church or an organization, I like to get a lay of the land. And so ask them, what have you been doing? What's working? What do you think is not working? What are the assets that you have floating around, whether it's print or digital? How are you communicating who you are as a community or an organization to those who have had long existing relationships with you and those who have never heard about you? And so what does that look like? And kind of begin to assess what it has looked like, what it currently looks like, and maybe vision with them what they hope it could look like.
That's great. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you almost have a bent toward design thinking, which is a really fascinating. We should do an episode on that sometime, Darby, Because that's a
Yeah.
cool area of doing exactly that. You analyze what are your assets, what are your tools available, what things are at your disposal to use in this endeavor, and then who is it for, and what do they need, and what do they want, and then how can you leverage what you've got to give you what they need and what they want in a way that can't be done somewhere else that's unique to you. And I know it started, that concept kind of started back with furniture design, about 100 years ago. And it was interesting to see how the way of thinking that designers would leverage to make a chair, now we can create whole businesses or leverage it on how to help a church really reach its community with life-giving message,
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point is we don't ask those questions. We don't ask, well, do we need a website? Do we need this brochure? Do we need like 5 versions of this brochure?
Right.
And oftentimes we are influenced by our peers. And so if we were told or we see someone has, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Vine, Vimeo, YouTube, like whatever
Right.
that list is, we sometimes feel that we need to do all of those things. And it might be that you do, and it might be that you don't. And so what are ways that we can ask better questions and really say, well, who is this for and what purpose is it serving before we go out and,
absolutely.
open up all of those accounts?
Yeah, asking the why it's the least asked question and the most needed to be asked question,
Right.
I think, in the
Right.
communications world.
And many times when you ask the why, you realize you don't need to do these 4 other platforms. Maybe you just do Facebook really, really well.
Right.
Or Instagram is starting to get really popular.
Yeah.
Not starting, it's been. I mean, it's
For
it's.
some
I mean,
churches, it's
I mean,
very,
it's
very new.
it's like starting to surpass like Twitter and
Yeah.
Yeah.
just asking that why is so important.
So you're not just a communicator, but you are also an entrepreneur, I think. And, we were talking earlier before the podcast just about your food truck and just what you're doing in the food world and what you've been dreaming of doing. And that just made me think communicators can play a really key role in connecting entrepreneurs to the church and bringing those skill sets to leverage. Can you speak a little bit to that? Have you seen that work or not work in the church world?
Yeah, I think as things shift in the church world, we as church leaders or those who are involved with a church or faith community have sort of had to pick up this entrepreneur spirit in the ways that we do things. Things about church, about worship, about the ways that we do and be church don't look the same as they did 10 years ago, 50 years ago, right? And we can see some of those shifts. And so I think communicators just by nature have that mindset to know that what I write today there's a possibility that it could be irrelevant in like a week. And so we sort of have to be nimble in that way. And I think that can be applied to a lot of the work that we do as churches. One of my interests is around food and bringing people together around conversations around a table. And so I have a pop-up at the Nashville Farmers Market. And that was partly an attempt to test out the food scene, but also to see where some of those conversations around food or over food could happen. And so I've done some community dinners where there are anywhere from like 5 to 15 people gather around a table. And my hope is that we use the gathering around food as a way to engage people around conversations that might not be as easy as we've seen on social media.
Yeah.
And so communications in that regard has been really beneficial because as someone whose name isn't known in the city and who's trying to do something different, I've had to find ways to use my communication skills to be able to tell a story to someone who has maybe 5 to 10 second sort of attention span on my Facebook page or my website, or even in a conversation. And so I think communications has been a really great tool to use to engage people in different ways. And I say tool because a lot of people see communications as the end goal. If I have a great social media presence, like more people are going to come, or I'll get young people to my church. And that's really not true at all. We use it as a platform to communicate all the wonderful things that God might be doing in your life or in the community there at your congregation, but it's not meant to be the thing that we focus on. It's a way to invite, it's a way to welcome, it's a way to really share the why and the who of your particular community.
Yeah, absolutely. And just from our previous conversations, hospitality just keeps coming up as something that is important to you. And I think if I can claim that as one of your emphases, and I think one of the most needed emphases for communicators in the church,
Yeah, it's so key. I mean, we see over and over in Scripture the ways that we are called to be hospitable to sojourner, the widow, the orphan, those on the marginalized who are in our midst. And so what does that look like as the pastor or the lay leader or someone on staff at a church? How does that call to be hospitable translate to those who have never been to your church, those who are looking for a church home? How do we communicate those values of hospitality to someone who you don't have a relationship with? And I think that can look like a lot of things. It can look like on a Sunday morning before the pastor does his greeting or message, introducing himself. The church that I attend, the Village, Nashville, our pastor, Travis, every time he gets up there, there's no assumption that anyone knows or cares who he is, right? Like we sometimes, I think, have these feelings of like, oh, you know who I am because you've seen me here. But that's not the case. And so as he goes up, the first thing he says is, hey, my name is Travis. I'm one of the pastors here. Even though he's the lead pastor, I'm one of the pastors here. And the care and the time just to spend a few seconds to introduce yourself, I think is so important, because then someone who doesn't know who that is now feels like, hey, I'm not the only one. I didn't have to ask that question.
Oh, it's so important. It's just these little subtle things you can do to crank up the hospitality dial on your church. It's huge.
Right.
What are some of the other things that you can do in the environment, in the worship setting, to make people who are new to the church or coming back to the church comfortable?
Yeah, so our greeter and usher team and parking direction team is one of the bigger areas that folks can serve. And so we ask the question from the moment someone drives into the lot of the school, because we worship at a school right now, what are they going to feel and what are they going to know about us from that first moment where they turn in from the main road to go into the parking lot? So we've got people directing traffic from that very first driveway that they turn in, and then when they get to the end of that road to tell them to go left or right, as they get out of the car and walk on the sidewalk before they even hit the sidewalk that leads up to, the double doors to get into the school. We've got someone greeting them, saying good morning, directing them onto the next spot. So every short distance, you've just got someone there with a smile waiting to direct you onto the next place. And then when you go in, someone's there to greet you, to show you where the donuts and the coffee are, or to, welcome you into the worship space and give you a bulletin. And so, I would hate for someone to go into any new place and never be greeted by anyone. I think that says a lot about the community too. So hospitality is a big thing at our church.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I want to jump off that a little bit, because there are so many churches that are church plants, that are younger churches, that are struggling churches, or replaced churches. You know what I mean? Like relocated, I guess would be a better way to say that. So many of these churches are worshiping in schools and in theaters and warehouse rooms. Yeah. As a communicator, let's talk about the importance of controlling the visual branding in that space, as a way of being hospitable. Because you can walk in, you can drive up into a high school parking lot and just be thoroughly confused if you don't have a lot of church experience, if you haven't seen that kind of thing before. What are some of the steps that you can take to visually, through more than just people, welcome people into your space?
People, as you mentioned, is a big part of it. Because we make up the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to people, as obvious as this sounds, signage is really important.
Yeah.
So as someone looks around the room, do they know where to go if they need to use a restroom? Do they know where to go if they're ready to go inside to worship?
Where to take their kids?
Yeah, where to take their kids if there's childcare. And is all of that clear? I think sometimes we just have these assumptions that people can figure it out and that it's obvious, but it's really not, right? We should always have the assumption that people need some sort of direction or instruction. And so what would our church, how would we design our space to reflect that, if that's important, right? So whether it's signage that has all of the cohesive branding, right? If we have a particular color palette that we use, and this might sound too sort of designy, markety for some people, but I think all of those pieces, the tighter you make them and the more cohesive you make them, also communicates the story that you took care to put all these pieces together. It's important that you're here. We're glad you're here. And so everything kind of should match, from the ways that people greet those who walk into the door, to what the bulletin looks like, to what the signs that roll up and pop up look like that you have to set up every Sunday. All those pieces have to tie together and have a purpose, right? Because we don't want to just put random things up. But what does each of those pieces say about who you are as a community, even to the worship space? So When someone walks in there, like, is it bright? Can they find their way
Yes.
around, or is it dark? And are
Right.
they going to trip over something?
Right.
Because you thought the ambience was great, but it's really hard for someone who has a walker to walk in. So what do all those pieces look like? And how are you creating a space that says, we're glad you're here and you're welcome here?
Absolutely. I was part of a church for a long time that had basically nobody over the age of 50. And everyone would ask why. Well, the lighting was so low, and the songs were printed in the bulletin in roughly size 0.3 font, being a little hyperbolic, but it was very small, and it was very hard to read. So I brought my grandparents one time, and I noticed they weren't singing any of the songs. And I asked later why, and they're like, well, we can't read this. It's too small and it's too dark, you know? And it's those basic little things that you can do. Just turn the lights up if you need to, make the font a little bit bigger if you need to, add an extra page. That communicates, we thought of you.
Right. And I think that's such an important point. I think about a friend who goes to the village with me, and he is in a motorized scooter. And so those who are able-bodied and not thinking about those with disabilities might not ever think, can they get through this door? Like, have we put the aisles have we put the chairs too close together that he can't even scoot down the aisle? Did we take out enough chairs so that his scooter can fit in there? So I think those are a lot of the questions that we forget to ask because we are not necessarily in that community or, in his case, with that particular disability. But those are really important questions to ask because what does that communicate about? Well, I don't feel welcome here because you didn't think that someone in my condition would show up at your church.
And going back to being able to see lyrics, if you're not printing your songs in a hymnal or in a bulletin, and you're doing projected lyrics, just sit down in the very back row and see if you can see the words on the screen and adjust it accordingly.
Yeah.
And one really more pragmatic thing that I would add is if you're in one of those spaces with like the washed out fluorescent lighting, maybe it's a gym, and you've got the folded up bleachers on the sides and it's just kind of a busy space, you can use signage to take control visually, not just for directing people to the restrooms or childcare, which is important. You should do that. But you can put up something that's important to you on one of those roll-out vinyl banners, and then frame it on either side of where the podium's going to be, right? A quote, a verse, a symbol, something like that. And then you can also use lights on the signage from the ground to help guide the eye and lessen the busyness of the room. And those are things that, honestly, that I learned at doing conferences, setting up booths at conferences. And it just translates so well into those kind of alternative church spaces.
Yeah, and I think to add to that one more thing, how are we using all of those opportunities to communicate who we are? So one of the things we say at the village is no one belongs here more than you. And so you hear that over and over again. You see it on social media. You hear it on a Sunday morning. You might see it on Sunday morning or in the bulletin, right? So if the Sunday morning is the only time you have to engage with people, how are you using that to communicate who you are as a church?
Absolutely. I would be very curious to hear about some of the particular challenges that you've seen communicators face in those younger churches or those church plants. Do you have one or two that come to mind?
Yeah, so I think about one of our new church plants in Seattle that is 6 or 7 years old now. But when they first started, they had one pastor who was intentional about spending that first year really just listening to the community. And so that was his role. He got out and met all the business owners, got out and met folks who gathered at coffee shops and other spaces to hear, what is it you love about this community? What are some of the needs that you might have identified in the community? And really became a fabric of that community before they ever launched any sort of gathering, right? He became a part of the community. And I think that's so important because sometimes we come into, a new church or setting or an organization and say off the bat, like, you're ready to say, here's what you need.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case, right? Like there are people who have been in that community for maybe a few years and maybe not necessarily the church, but they've been a part of the surrounding community. And so to take care to ask those questions about what is this community like what are your hopes and dreams and visions and things that you'd like to see maybe done differently. And then from that posture, begin to say, well, I've heard this, so perhaps this is one area that we can start working on. And to begin there, I know it's easy to sit there and kind of pick apart things and say, well, why aren't you on Instagram, or why don't you have a Twitter account? Maybe that's not the most important thing necessarily to start in this community, but maybe it is. And so I think taking time to ask those questions is really important.
Yeah, that's really good.
I think, as a communications person, understanding what your core message is really important. I mean, I know for the United Methodist Church, making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world really guides all that we do. The gospel guides all we do. But then what does that look like as you translate it to like a brochure or a website or your social media? How are all of those pieces communicated in the nuanced ways that they would need to for each context? But how's that message coming through? And I think sometimes we shy away from that core message because we are so scared of not attracting people who have not been connected to a church that it's like, oh, we're just, just come, wear whatever, do whatever. Yeah. But there are people looking for meaning and people looking for a place to root themselves. And if we shy away from some of those basic things, that gets really complicated. So,
You're right.
Yeah.
You said something earlier today when we were chatting about not being ashamed of who you are. You're a church and they know you're a church and they're coming to see a church. And that really stuck with me, actually. And there's something about you're actually kind of honoring the visitor or the seeker, if you want to use that term, the unchurched. You're honoring them by saying, this is the core. This is what we really are. I'm not watering this down for you. We think that you're going to want to understand this and engage with us on this. It's a way of showing respect and dignifying that person, I think.
I agree. I totally agree with that. Now, and how we begin to walk those folks who do show up and choose to stay and come back another week and another week and another week. Now, how we begin to walk them through the process of, and this is what it means to be a part of this community. I think that's where we get into the weeds of how to continue to be welcoming and hospitable to someone who doesn't get all the church language, right? We don't assume that they know all the things. So how do we take care to explain those things?
Right. And
what are some of the things that you do outside of the church context, outside of the four walls, to make them feel comfortable with your community? What sorts of things do you do Monday through Saturday?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of this church in Seattle called Valley and Mountain, and they didn't call it Theology on Tap because I think that name is actually trademarked, but something similar, and it was held at like an Ethiopian restaurant in the neighborhood. And so it was an invitation for people to gather to talk about questions about life and theology and faith, but it was just this open space. And so that was a neutral space that people could gather for those who did not feel comfortable in a church setting. And they actually didn't have a church because, again, they were a new church start.
Right.
But what are those spaces in the community where people are already gathering that you could begin to be a part of, right? Not to take over, but to say we're a part of this community too. Like, let's gather and let's talk and let's get to know each other. And so that's one of the things that they did. And I know a number of churches have something similar, whether they call it Theology on Tap or not. The other thing is at the church that I currently attend, we would have these just like splash events where we invited the community to join. So it was like game night at Owl Creek Park. So like bring your favorite game, whether it's like a board game or like a volleyball or softball to throw around. We'll bring the drinks and some snacks, like just come and hang.
Yeah,
with no agenda.
Great, yeah.
And
that's
I think,
really fun.
And I think those spaces that are sort of the in-between church and community and work are really important spaces to be a part of because like there really is no agenda other than to get to know one another. And I think those can be really beautiful spaces. I think sometimes we get caught in this trap of thinking, well, I'm a pastor or I'm the head of this church. And so every time we have a gathering, we need to make sure we communicate that Jesus loves them, literally say that.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of what we believe can be communicated in our actions. And so what does it mean to just like have this free event where you're not charging anyone for food, but you're just asking people to come and hang out? I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that can be a great way for people to say, well, they're doing something different. How can I be a part of that?
Yeah. Francis of Assisi said, communicate the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. That's one of the most overused and abused quotes, I think, from church history. But what he was trying to emphasize was exactly that, because he's not saying don't preach the gospel.
Right.
The man stood on street corners and preached the gospel every day of his adult life. But he is saying if you're preaching the gospel, but you're not living the gospel, you're not preaching the gospel.
Yeah, and so, Darby, you reminded me of another story. So there are a couple of things that we have done over the past few years. I mean, the church is only barely 2 years old. But during the break the winter break, we have a relationship with our local schools. And so we ask the school administration, are there families who are sort of in this gap where they don't have access to food during the winter break because the students are on free or reduced lunch? So is there a way that we can help in that time to serve the needs of your students and their families? And so when we first did this, we served 100, no, I think we only did like 30 or 40 families with 4 to 5 boxes of food and turkey and things like that each. This year it expanded to 500 boxes. And so
that's awesome.
It was amazing. We took up the entire gym. Folks showed up on a Sunday morning. We packed food and then took turns delivering it to different families. And so I think the question of what do we do like Monday through Saturday is an important one, because that gets back to what are the needs of the community, right? And if we're listening, we'll find out what those are. So there was a neighbor in one of our neighborhoods that's not too far from the church, and the house burnt to the ground, to the foundation. And folks in the neighborhood who did attend church began to ask, like, what can we do? And so it was very quiet in terms of, like, we didn't take up a collection. We just were able to find funds to be able to buy them gift cards to give and say, like, we don't really know you, but we saw that there was a need, and if this can help at all, please take this. And so I think if we really do care, number one, about the welfare of the city and the welfare of our neighbors, then that's what it looks like, right? We're listening to those opportunities where we can join people and families and individuals in their lives. And if it ends up being a relationship that continues, amazing. And if not, then they at least knew that there was this one church that reached out to them in their time of need.
Absolutely. The last thing I want to ask you is, to churches who are maybe for the first time considering bringing a communications and marketing person onto their staff or onto their core team, what would you advise them to look for in that person? What are maybe the top, few things?
There's someone who obviously has a command of this field, right? You want them to be leading and teaching you and not the other way around. But I think the other part is, the flip side of that is like someone who's willing to listen. I think even though we have the set of skills that we were trained to do, I think it's really important that the person doing communications is also able to listen and receive instruction from those who are also in ministry and doing work in a different way. So someone who listens, someone who is nimble, and, as a new faith community, for example, might not have all the resources to subscribe to all the things. And so someone who's able to kind of gather the resources that are needed with a modest budget. So I think that's really important. I think sometimes you can hire a communications professional and they expect like subscriptions to Adobe and to all these stock images, and that's just not the reality. That could be a subscription to like stock images could be like your budget for the entire year. And so what are other creative ways that you can go about doing the work that you need to do without spending tons of money? The other thing I think that's really important is someone who's really collaborative. And so collaborative and proactive. So you're not necessarily just waiting for someone to come and bring all the things that need to be communicated, but you're also listening and finding, like, how does what you're doing in this ministry area and what you're doing connect, and how can we find bridges to those things so that, again, back to communicating who you are as a church, so that we can fuse those together and tell a better story about who you are as a church. Someone who understands media, I think, is really important, whether it's the PR side of media and being able to communicate that message to a local newspaper or radio.
That's an underemphasized element of church communications.
Yeah.
We need to talk more about that.
Yeah, and so I will just give this one plug to Auburn Seminary has a media center, and they do such excellent work because they talk about what does your core message look like, how can you pivot sort of in this triangle. So they've got really great resources. They work with seminaries, nonprofits, churches to do that media training. Yeah, so I think those are some of the handful of things that I would be looking for. And I will just add one more thing, someone who's connected beyond the church, because I think that's really important. When you have someone who's so internally focused on church stuff, you miss opportunities to see how those connect beyond the building or beyond the church community into the wider community that we are part of for the rest of our week.
Absolutely.
Speaking of training, you mentioned Auburn Media Training. We'll put links to that in the description. Yeah. But New Church Starts is a division of Path One, which is a ministry of discipleship ministries. They do a lot of media or New Church Start training, and they have all sorts of resources that you can check out. So we'll also put some links to that. You should definitely check it out.
That's great. That's some really helpful advice. And listeners, take that to heart. That's from a real bona fide expert. But it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast, and honestly, just for all of the work that you've done in the church, bringing all of these expertises to bear. Is that a word?
It is now.
It is now.
Is there any kind of last word that you want to leave our listeners, when thinking about starting a new church?
Yeah. So there are a lot of folks that I work with, especially those who have not grown up with the current media that we have access to now, who are so afraid to break something, and they're afraid to dip their toes in and try. And so I say, you're probably not going to break something. Pick one channel that you want to learn and do it well. And I think from there, you'll realize that this is a really empowering and interesting and fun space to be in.
Right.
You end up having conversations with people that you probably wouldn't have ever engaged with had it not been for Twitter or Facebook. And there's a lot of crazy, not helpful stuff on the internet and social media, but I think the challenge for us as people of faith is to share the love of God, love of neighbor, and the city of hope and peace and grace to those spaces that might rarely get to hear it. And so we have some platforms to do that, and it's a matter of how we choose to do that wisely.
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want to get in touch with Sophia, you can follow her on Twitter at Sophia Chris with a K. So Sophia, K-R-I-S.
That's right.
And if you've got any questions or comments or stories for me or Darby, you can hit us up at podcast@umcom.org. As always, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.